Our focus is on the minimum wage. The Nigeria Governors Forum, in a recent move, earlier says that state governors have been engaging with the respective branches of the Nigeria Labour Congress and other unions to meet up with the December 31st minimum wage implementation deadline. The federal government and Labour, earlier on October 18th, announced an agreement on the implementation of the new wage. The Federal Executive Council, also at its meeting in October, also presided over by Vice President Yemi Osinbajo, approved the agreement and set dates for the takeoff of the new wage and payment of the arrears. FEC also directed that the payment of the new salary structure should also take effect from April 18th and the arrears cleared by December the 31st. Now, joining me in our Lagos studio to discuss this and much more, I have Adeyemi Ajayi, the Director, Strategy Advocacy of the Chartered Institute of Personnel Management of Nigeria. Good to have you on the breakfast show today.
Good morning. How are you?
Good. Now, President Buhari signed the new minimum wage bill into law on April the 18th. Now, so far, in terms of how much of an effort we are putting towards implementation, what do you make of the move so far by the Nigeria Governors Forum, as well as labor unions, and the lines of communication we've had over the salary adjustment?
Well, on April 18th, 2020, last year it was agreed that this minimum wage should be paid, and there was a deadline. However, the governors came back. They said, see, we need an adjustment for this, and the adjustment would be better done considering that this affected level 1 to 7 of the officers in the service, and that for levels above that, there will be need to do an adjustment. So I think along the line, there was no good communication between both. And now a lot of governors have not been able to implement this. And at this point, there is need to have a middle line between the labor and the government so that there should be a seamless implementation. We all know what is happening. It may not be effective immediately, but I think there should be conversation.
So talking about having conversations now, what should be brought to the table at this point in time? Yes, we understand how difficult the climes are. The global economy is facing quite a lull at this point in time. So bringing the conversation back home, because at the end of the day, it all depends on resources. Some would push the agenda that governors are not owed their salaries, so workers should not be denied of their wages. But at this point in time, going by the differential elements that play out state by state, how do we have a conversation that cuts across?
Yeah, I think the governors should initiate these conversations. And why they should initiate the conversation is basically to reach out first to labor, because labor will definitely react if this is not being implemented. However, the conversation should set around the priorities of the government. The government provides essential social services, and that should be the focus this time around. And I think labor should understand that this pandemic has caused a lot of disruption in terms of internally generated revenue for the state. And this conversation should be like, okay, when are we going to actually implement this? Or when are we going to come back? Because some state government, they've implemented and eventually they suspended the payment. So they should communicate with labor. When do they think that they should return back to paying the minimum wage? And not just that, they should also make the communication clear about payment of arrears to these workers. So I think that should be the main focus of their conversation.
With you now, your focus is on the Nigeria Governors Forum pushing the agenda to labor unions. But at this point in time, still going back to how much of a conversation we should have, what's your expectation as well from the labor unions? Because at the end of the day, it takes two to tango. We have to have a stronger push from labor. Yes, the times are quite hard, but it's also harder on the workers, wouldn't you say? So what sort of conversation should also labor bring to the table now, and then we can find a fine line? If not, the body language of labor at the end of the day, industrial action.
Yeah. One thing we should all know is that Nigeria's revenue has declined about 60%, which means that many states will have to suffer that. So what labor should bring to the table is that there shouldn't be suspension of payment of this wage, even if it's reverting to the old wage. Let me put it clearly, which means if they are paying the old wage, the government should agree that they are owing the arrears, or they would be owing the arrears. So, in a nutshell, what Labour should be pushing for is that even if they are reverting to paying the old minimum wage, the arrears should be paid sometimes in the future, and the government should agree to this time with Labour.
Now, as at last month, 11 states were yet to begin the implementation of the 30,000 naira minimum wage. Also recall that the president signed the new Minimum Wage Act into law effective April 18th last year. Now, at this point in time, taking a cue globally, what's happening? We've seen hundreds of thousands of job cuts, requests for bailout and interventions. That's insufficient on its own, Bill, but now looking at stimulus to stabilize the business climate here in Nigeria at state-by-state level, the capacity differential is now brought to the fore much more evidently. What should we do now to sustain the moves on the part of the governors at this point in time, no longer giving excuses or any further delays?
Yeah, I think first looking at it globally, the pandemic affected, is still affecting so many countries, and estimatedly we lost over 1 billion jobs, globally, and that is quite very pathetic, and that has caused a lot of problems. Now, coming back home, it has caused a lot of things both in the public and private sectors in terms of revenue the shrink in revenue. And apart from the shrink in revenue, there is also rising cost of doing business on the other side. So if we look at it comparatively, the effect of the pandemic is quite very huge. And this is a time that every stakeholder should create an understanding of what to do. So if you ask me, this is a point that priorities should be given to the most important things.
Let's paint a clearer picture at this point in time. Now, Adamawa, Ekiti, Kogi, for example, use this as your case study. Okay. What should be the plan of action at this point, looking at state and inward, boosting internally generated revenue, so that then in the long term they can be able to sustain any other upward review of the minimum wage?
Yeah. You see, at this point, the states you mentioned, Ekiti, Nasarawa, Gombe, Adamawa, these are states that they've suspended the payment of the minimum wage. But what I will advise is that even at that, they should still, if they can still pay the old wage, that is fine. And that is what they should do. But in terms of generating internal revenue, this is something that should have been done years back. But I mean, it's not too late to start. And at this point, I first think the state should look inward and look at the economic potentials they have to drive the business. For example, Ekiti State, I'm from Ekiti State, and I've written papers in the past on how Ekiti State can generate its own money. So I think this is a time for the government of various states to look inward on how they can generate revenue for their state. So I think over-reliance on the center, you know what I mean,
for
has
support.
been a major problem.
And talking about reliance on the center for support now, let's look at the fact that we've had bailouts, we've had interventions in the past, and one of the issues Labour has also raised is the fact that we've not necessarily seen enough of transparency, enough of a clear picture being painted, even distribution, and some issues of corruption here and there. So now that we also have shrinkage in funds, those gaps are now much more widened. And in the next few months, we never can tell what would happen next. Yes, the lockdown measures are still intact and a whole lot more. Operation is just gradually resuming. But at the end of the day, the economy will open back in full scale, and all of these issues must be attended to.
Yeah, you know, one thing that we should know is that despite the pandemic, despite the situation, there's still inflows from the center, to various states. So the question is, what's the impact on the entire workforce in that state? What values does it bring to them? Again, if that doesn't stop, I do not see a reason why any government of any state should stop paying its workers. That's the first. And the second is, I expect this is a time that many states should start coming together and start brainstorming on how they should get out of this problem and have a future or long-term plan. I mean, for survival, for sustenance, and have a very wonderful government in place.
Thank you very much for your contribution on the Breakfast Show today, Adeyemi Ajayi.